This is a subject that people are afraid to talk about. I mean, it really is one of the top 2 subjects outside of finances and marriage that cause the most reasons for problems, communication, divorce, is sex. And tonight we're going to talk to you about that subject because we feel it's very, very important. We all enter marriage with preconceived ideas about sex. You get them from what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've read, or what you've experienced. So we're asking that before you begin your journey into marriage, and those of you who are already married, that we want you to see the beauty of sex the way God designed it. Not the way the world portrays it, but the way that God designed it.
But just starting out tonight, a little bit about our background. Theresa is my first and only wife. I mean, I haven't been married before. We have 3 children. 2 of those are Theresa's from a previous marriage, and then we have 1 child together. So it was kind of we got married at the beginning of my senior year in college, and one of those things that's not well known, but we actually lived together for a year before we did get married, and I was fat, dumb, and happy. I could have just kept right on going. I didn't need to get. At least I didn't think that I needed to get married. I thought everything was fine, and to coin that phrase, I had my cake and could eat it too, and I didn't feel a need for any commitment, which was kind of interesting because coming from my background, my mom had been married. Well, she's on her 4th husband, which they've been married for quite some time. But I was the oldest of 11 children, and a lot of those were half brothers and sisters and step brothers and sisters. So just marriage itself wasn't well modeled for me. So for me, I didn't want to really even take that risk in getting married. So. But at one point in time, Theresa's like, no, this isn't cutting it for me. So we either have to move forward or we're going to have to find something else to do. So when that came about, we did end up getting married like 3 months after that, and this August we will have been married for 20 years. So it's been a wild time. It's been a great time, but there's always something new.
Yep. As Les said, I was previously married. I was married for 4 years, and our 2 oldest are from my first marriage. When I married Les, our daughter was 3, and my son Derek was 18 months old. So basically, Les is their dad. They have had contact with their dad, but in an environment where I had the kids, they were raised with him as their dad. I grew up in a home where my parents' views on sex were as different as night and day. There really was no balance. My mom was very prudish, very embarrassed about it, and my dad was totally the opposite. Very overbearing, pushy about it. It was just an uncomfortable environment because there was no meeting ground. And so for me, basically my sex education, my parents did have sex education with us, but mine came a lot from my religious background. And we'll get into that a little bit later in our talk.
So like I said, this is one of the most difficult subjects there is to talk about in premarital or even in a marriage is sex. And we find it's really interesting that we can joke about it. I mean, I don't know how many emails I get or who finds my email address or where things get forwarded to, but still even the number one websites that are visited on the internet today are still pornography websites. I mean, if you took all of that off of the net, the overall usage would be a very small amount if that was gone. But that's really not what God had created for us at all, is to deal with sex or talk about sex in that particular context. Marital sex is the most important and it really is the only appropriate kind. But it gets ignored, and couples really do pay a terrible price if they really don't focus on what God had intended for sex. And you've heard it said that it's wise to learn from experience, so that's one of the things we're talking about tonight, is just some of the experiences that we've had. And I know that when we get in the breakout sessions, some of the other group leaders will share about some of the things that they've experienced both on the women's side and the men's side. I didn't prepare you for that tonight, Steve, so just be ready, okay? But and also, they also say that experience is one of the best teachers, but if there are things that you can, knowledge that you can take away that you don't have to learn, the hard knocks, that's often the best way to go. We are not the Dr. Ruth and the Dr. Phil of sex, so
No.
we're not going to be able to answer all your questions at all. So, and you won't get the Dr. Phil approach tonight either. So, but God's view on sex, we have to understand that God loves us enough to have created a really precious and wonderful gift as sex, and just from the simple matter that God created it, just makes it wonderful. That's one of the things that we need, and we need to celebrate that creation. And God's very pleased when we desire the one we love within the confines of marriage. And that's one of the things we'll really talk about tonight, is it was really intended to be within the confines of marriage. Since he designed sex, it makes sense that we'd be delighted, or that he would be delighted when we practice it according to his will. And sex, as God created it, results in just a wonderful satisfaction for both the husband and the wife. But we also have to keep in mind that if we violate that principle of marital sex, it takes away from the fulfillment that God really has planned and intended for us. In Genesis 2:24, and I've got several scripture references here, so you don't need to worry about that. We'll get you some notes on that. In Genesis 2:24, and Matthew 19:5, Mark 10:8, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians 5:31, it talks about where God's design was for us to become one flesh, and in those scriptures you'll find the two will become one. And God formed us really for that particular purpose within the confines of marital sex. And what truly sustains the beauty of sex? And there's really one thing that does, and that's valuing it. Giving sex the time and attention that it needs. It's just not something that you just jump into. I mean, it's one of those things that really does need to take the time, taking the time to learn about one another. And it's really about giving yourself entirely to your spouse. It's serving one another. It's ministering life. It's encouragement, and that's why a woman or a man does not want to just jump in from one bed to another. You really want to save yourself for your spouse and for that marriage. It's not just about the climax. It's the oneness that goes beyond the physical aspect of it. Truly getting to that higher plateau. And the best illustration in the Bible comes from Song of Solomon. It's one book out of 66 books in the Bible, and it's devoted to one thing, and that's the beauty of an undefiled marriage bed. And that's one of the things we really need to keep in mind. Hebrews 13:4 says that marriage must be respected by all, and the marriage bed kept undefiled, because God will judge immoral people and adulterers. What we see in the Song of Solomon, it truly is sacred love. Love that frees one from performance, from keeping up with the bodies of others, the passions of others, and the desires of others. And it's really made for you and your spouse. The more we understand about sex and about our spouse, the more patient we become. And 1 Corinthians 13:4 tells us that love is patient. That means that we need to put a lot of time into learning about our spouse and learning what pleases them and what doesn't please them. And the next time you think that your patience has reached its limits, just remember how patient and understanding Christ has been for us. Ephesians 4:2 tells us, be patient with one another, making allowances for each other's faults because of your love. And this is where we're secure in one another's love and commitment, regardless of what happens or does not happen on any particular night. Being patient, however, demands a cost, and we have to set aside time on our agenda. We have to yield our rights to welcome each other with open arms. Proverbs 19:11 reminds us, "A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is his glory to overlook an offense." And one of the most practical steps towards real patience is just truly learning to listen to your spouse. What makes the Song of Solomon such a classic? Because it doesn't read like a dirty novel at all. But it's just filled with just wonderful illustrations. But it's about a man and a woman who greatly appreciate one another's physical attributes. And it's about the love and the pleasure that God intended that relationship to have. It's not something that you talk about in the locker room after playing a round of racquetball or lifting weights, but it really is, purity and sacredness. And the comparison is never made about the past lovers or the ideal woman. I mean, Solomon's total focus is his bride. And he treasures the Shulamite woman beyond all belief when you really read the words that are in the Song of Solomon. And it's not, but not only that, in the words you can tell that it's an enjoyable and a fulfilling relationship. Truly what God's intention for us is.
I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of sex in your marriage. Actually, it should become one of the most important parts of your life, whether you want it to be or not, because it's going to affect every facet of your life. If you do not treat it that way, then you are shortchanging your spouse. Sex as God intended it is to be enjoyed to its utmost by being totally transparent and open with your spouse. And that sounds really easy to say, but it's not. When it comes to sex, it's not. It's something you have to work at, and you have to be willing to practice it. You have to spend time thinking of ways to keep sex fresh and fun. You need to study your spouse and discover what fulfills them sexually. Guess what, guys and ladies? Sex is not about you. It's about your spouse. And that's not what the world teaches us. We really are, if we're doing it the way God wants us to do it, we are about finding what pleases our spouse and doing what they want to do for us to fulfill our needs. That's when we honor and we're honest. Proverbs talks to us about honesty. Honesty deepens our relationship and makes us transparent with each other. Every husband and wife should take the responsibility of acquiring the necessary information to ensure that you're satisfying each other sexually. Fulfilling sex is one of the most powerful glues that you can have in your relationship. A sexually fulfilled man is a better father and a better employee. A sexually fulfilled woman has less stress in her life and more joy in her life. So that tells you how sex is vitally important to a healthy marriage. When we accept that God is pleased with when a married couple sexually satisfies each other, it removes any doubt for us to express ourselves because we know it's okay. He created it. Children are able to sense the security that flows between their parents when they witness and communicate that you respect one another and that you have a sexually fulfilled relationship. This is an example that we can set for our children someday when they have a spouse. And it was something we were always open with our children about. In fact, it's really funny now because Dan Cox, our pastor, walked into the copy room while I was making copies of that stuff for you guys, and Joni, his secretary, and I were over in the corner talking about it, and we didn't even know he was standing there. And so she's asking me some of the things that I'm going to talk about with you women afterwards, and he kind of clears his voice, and we're like, "Oh, Dan, we didn't know you were there." And he's like, "I heard a lot." And I'm like, "Oh, and how was that?" And he said, "Oh, I think I'm going to be embarrassed." I said, "How can you be embarrassed?" I said, "As a pastor, you know that this is the most great and awesome thing that God created." And he goes, "Yeah, you're right." And, it's just one of those things that if you teach your kids that, that's exactly what they're going to think about it. And, our youngest daughter, so we finished the conversation with Dan, and I said, "Yeah, the joke at our house with our daughter is, Mom and Dad, go get a room." And it's like, "No, you get a room, you move out. We want the whole house, not just one room.
She's graduating here in a couple weeks, so
so that's always the funny joke at our house. You know, she's like, oh my gosh. So,
guys, one of the things that it's also really pretty important. One of the big things when it comes to sex has to do with affection. And every time a couple gives or receives affection, they truly wrap a layer of protection around their marriage, and it's really something that's very critical. And it's affection, I think, is really easy for women, but it becomes a little more difficult for guys. I mean, it took me a long time to realize after we were married just what it meant to be affectionate. It just wasn't something that had been modeled very well for me. But some of the ways to establish affection in your marriage, you need to be able to show affection often, and make sure that you realize that you don't confuse affection with sex, because they're two different things. And that's even our daughters, like, even if I'm giving Theresa a hug or a kiss, and she's just like, oh guys, come on, you know. Talk about what pleases your spouse, but one of the things you never want to do is never withhold affection to punish your spouse. And we'll talk about it later on as well, but you never want to withhold sex to punish your spouse as well. You want to be able to plan some spontaneity into your marriage, and do not wait for your spouse to show affection first. I mean, initiate it, guys. I mean, I know it's tough, but build a bridge and get over it. Be patient with an unaffectionate spouse. If you're and you know, God only knows, Theresa was very patient with me.
Well, and that's my love language, physical touch. So for me, it's even more profound, because that's my, you know, how I want to be treated. And I mean, I want to hold hands, I want to hug. It doesn't matter where. It's just how I am.
And surprisingly enough, that's one of my love languages today as well. But if I'd taken that assessment 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been one of my love languages at all. Don't keep score in your marriage, especially when it comes to the affection. I mean, that's the big thing. And being a CPA, I mean, it would be real easy for me to just fill books on, you know, okay, you were a little short here, you know, you're a little long here, but it didn't compensate for what happened over here. Try new things to please your spouse, but if your spouse fails, don't be critical about them as well.
One of the things I want to talk to you about is communication. Communication and sexual satisfaction go hand in hand. You can't find out what satisfies you in sex if you don't tell your spouse. According to research, effective communication precedes and predicts later relationship problems that you're going to have. Without the skill of communication, your relationship is going to be hampered significantly. Here's some issues that I kind of want to go over with you guys that may be difficult to talk about, but they're critical if you want to reach God's design for healthy sexual intimacy. The first one's masturbation. It's a question that comes up often. People don't like to talk about it, but in God's eyes, that is not something that is appropriate in marriage. It's self-satisfying. That's what that is. And so what happens when people start masturbating, especially if they're young, it leads them into fantasies and eventually, statistically, into pornography. And so if you choose to do that in your marriage, you're opening the door for Satan, and you're opening the door that, you know, you'll be having sex with your spouse and you could be having a fantasy off somewhere else. So that is something that God does not look lightly upon. Abortion. I sit here today telling you I am a person who has had an abortion. But I know a God who forgives and heals. And yes, it's a grievous sin. It's something that I regret that I ever did. And I know my child awaits me when I get to heaven. But if you don't talk about it in your marriage, before you get married, it will become an issue. It became an issue for Les and I. When I got pregnant with Kayla, I was so fearful that God was going to do something awful to my baby. I deserved to be punished. that's not what God's like. And I went back into counseling and, was reaffirmed of the power of forgiveness and the power of God's grace and his mercy to set us free from all that. And we had a healthy, wonderful little girl. But if you don't deal with it, it will come back to haunt you. Sexually transmitted diseases. We know we live in an age of venereal diseases, AIDS, all of those kind of things. We can't just turn our back on them and act like they're not there. Those of us who have had sex before marriage know that that is a risk that we take. If you have one of those diseases, you can't hide that from your future spouse. You have to deal with it because other issues come into play if you don't. Illnesses and sicknesses. Whether you come into a marriage with some kind of illness or sickness, or whether you develop something after you're married, is so important to talk about. A big issue for women is endometriosis. It's something that I know of 2 married couples that had no idea the women had this before they got married, and they are dealing with it now that they're married, and it's very difficult. But they're willing to research and find out all the information, and their husbands are very supportive of them. Another example of illnesses is, you could end up with MS, muscular dystrophy. I mean, there's things that in our life as we go through, we have no idea what's going to happen. And you have to be willing to realize that sex is connected to those. Doesn't mean that it's everything. And that if you can't have sex at some time in your relationship when you're married, that it's the end of the world. But if you haven't communicated and had a good relationship sexually before that, it's going to make it even more difficult. Cancer. I know one of my biggest fears as a woman is breast cancer. What would I do if I lost my breasts? They're important to me, and in my interpretation, they're important to my husband. But that's not what defines me to him. He doesn't just look at my body, he looks at my heart. My heart is what makes him attracted to me. Prostate cancer for men. I mean, those are things, other cancers that you go through. My boss is a cancer survivor, and she'll tell you that for a long period of time, it's something they had to deal with in their relationship. It wasn't a priority. Life and death were. Paralyzation. When you look at Christopher Reeves, when I have spent a lot of time around people who are paralyzed in wheelchairs, either paraplegics or quadriplegics, when I worked at the VA, and we did activities, winter and summer, like Olympics and stuff. It's an issue. If it happens to you, you're going to have to find a way to deal with it and talk about it and work your way through that. So just keep in mind, there's just a whole gamut of things that you have to think about to be honest and open about that you may have gone through or are going through. And there is so much material available to help you work through it. That, sometimes, I know for me that sometimes if I feel so strongly that I just am scared and can't communicate it, then I write it. I will write it to Les. Because then I can give it to him and he can read it, feel like a big load's been lifted off my shoulder, and then we can talk about it. But just don't stuff it. You have to find a way to talk about all these kind of issues.
One of the other big things, and it can be a huge stumbling block when it comes to, after your marriage, but it's actually something you need to deal with before you're married, and that's our past mistakes. It's normal and it's natural for an engaged couple to really feel, a strong driving passion for one another. That's the way God created us. He created us with a sexual drive and desire, but He created it with that says, okay, we need to wait, and we need to save this for the marriage bed. But a sweet blessing comes to those who really maintain that purity without entanglements and bondages that come along with that. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that if you have had, and Theresa will be the first one to tell you, I had been very sexually active before we were married. And I didn't think anything about it. It was, like I said, it was something that hadn't been modeled well for me. But your future spouse really needs to know whether or not he or she is marrying a virgin. It may affect whether or not he or she decides to marry you, but it really is something that you need to get out on the table. Going into specific causes, you don't need to go into specifics. I mean, it's going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. And it's not necessary for you to share your past sexual experiences. Just let those memories die, and simply confess it. But confess it and then leave it at that. And I'm assuming that you know your future spouse well enough to know, if you haven't had that discussion, what their response would be, either positive or negatively. Because one thing about it, your past is not necessarily going to dictate what happens to your future. And we know that just because of the gracious God that we have. And God truly wants us to have just a thrilling and fulfilling sex life. And like I said, His forgiveness is very, very wonderful. And like I said, I have a very gracious wife as well, and she was very forgiving. Just as God endorses sex within marriage, He also clearly says that sex outside His marriage is disobedience for Him. He not only says don't, but He warns that premarital sex has a heavy price to pay. The price is the loss of some of the future fulfillment, pleasure, and joy He intended for you. Sex relations before marriage truly are contrary to God's plan, and it's an experience that will stand in our way of really developing a real deep level of intimacy if you don't deal with the issues. Now, premarital sex short circuits the divine plan reserved for those who keep themselves pure before marriage. And this is we kind of recrafted this talk from the last time that we gave it, and I don't know exactly where Theresa came up with this, but this made so much sense to me. But sex is the only action in the Bible that is sin before marriage, but it's holy after marriage. So I thought what a wonderful, wonderful statement that really
Yay, God.
is. It's a union that God sanctifies the relationship, and really repentance is necessary before we can experience what God really has planned for us. You may be among those who wish with all your being that you'd waited for marriage. I certainly wish that I had, because like I said, I mean, Theresa has been my only wife. But again, you need to give it over to God and not worry about the what if, or I wish I had. You need to put that behind you. It's really, and the one question that I have, is it possible to recover and get on with life? And my answer to that is yes. There is life after premarital sex, and all is not lost, again, because of the grace of God. So what are a couple of steps? We got 4 steps that you can use to redeem any failures that we had. The first is acknowledge it. It's not one of those things, again, that you can stuff down and hide. Confess it and renounce it, and truly make the decision to stop. And one of the areas that I think is really a good way to go is that if you don't feel that you have the capacity to be able to stop, get with someone who can pray with you. Find someone who can really, find someone who can keep you accountable. Probably somebody that's a Christian would probably be a good start. Some of the guys at work may not be the best. Where I work, I know it wouldn't be the best place to go for accountability partner. And the last thing is stick with your decision to walk in purity and obedience. And again, remember, God forgives. That's the big thing. And we can truly experience His blessings. Psalm 51 tells us that forgiveness brings cleansing, and cleansing brings joy. The heaviness is gone. And verse 9 also tells us that God will never mention our sins. Others may remind us, shun you, reject you, toss them in your face, but God never will. And that's the one thing that I think that truly is amazing. I mean, even family is not forgiving, in a lot of things, but God truly does forgiving, and what a gracious God we have.
And I would have to say, I agree that I wish I had never had sex before marriage. A little bit about the way that I was raised was very, very strict, what Lester always labels as fundamental legalist. It's that don't list in religion and you have no idea what relationship is about with Christ.
I think it was more the Encyclopedia Britannica of don'ts.
Don'ts, yeah. Basically, I couldn't cut my hair, couldn't wear makeup, couldn't watch TV, couldn't dance, couldn't wear pants, couldn't date anybody outside my faith. I mean, the list, just couldn't wear makeup, couldn't wear jewelry. The list was incredibly long. And so definitely sex outside of marriage was like an ultimate sin. And basically, if you had sex outside of marriage, you had to marry that person. And I had a sister that happened with, and it was one of the most dreadful, awful times in her life. She's no longer married to that person. But that's where the way that we were raised can have such an impact on what we think and we carry about sex into our relationship. And I truly believe that knowing the relationship I have with Jesus now and the freedom my kids have felt in having relationship with Christ and knowing that sex before marriage is not what God has planned, I believe that I may not have ventured down that road. For me, it was a path of, I'm going to show you what I can do, ha, ha, ha. And to this day, I wish that I had never had that attitude. An incredible story our daughter's volleyball coach told me when we were on a volleyball trip in the van. And I thought this was so awesome for her to be a witness as a Christian to a bunch of girls. One of the girls talked up and asked her, said, "Coach, what do you think about sex before marriage?" I tell you what, when your kids get into high school and you go on trips, you never know what happens in the buses, believe me, or what's talked about. And so Coach she was always so great and laid back. And she said, "Let me tell you a story." She said, "Let's take a treasure box and say your life is a treasure box as a woman." And this could apply to men also. And she said, God fills us with treasure when we're born, because he treasures us and he values us, and we're full of all kinds of gifts and treasures. Every time we choose to have sex outside of God's plan for marriage, a little piece of the treasure is taken out and dumped. And so by the time you find the person that God's designed for you to marry, and you open up your treasure box, what's left in it? And boy, I tell you what, that hit so many girls in that bus. I still remember it to this day, because it was so vivid of a picture to me of what I had exactly done, that I had lost so much of the treasure that I wanted to give the one person that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. This kind of brings us to the issue of what we call a crowded bed. Your marriage bed is going to be one of the most crowded places on the face of the earth. Everybody and their dog is going to try to get into there, whether it's through emotions, thoughts, whatever it is. It's the baggage you come into marriage with, and it will play a huge role in your marriage bed. The baggage is kind of what we call a rule book, and it's kind of unconscious. Some of it we don't even know is going to play out until we start down that road with our mate. Again, we talked about our rule books being shaped by our parents, our past experiences, all those kind of things. These are things in our rule book that, thanks to God, we can edit and get rid of. And that's something that we really need to work at doing. Another thing to understand is that the way you look at sex is the way you look at it. It doesn't make it right. And that, for me, was a huge statement that I had to deal with. Because, it's my personality. I'm a firstborn. I'm kind of strong-headed, strong-willed. And it was like, well, I know everything there is, and what I know is right kind of thing. And so this one really, God really just hammered that one home to me. Good lovers need to learn to know their lover better than they know themselves. And that sounds easy, but it's not. It takes a lot of work. You will have to stop viewing sex through your perception alone and start viewing it through your spouse's eyes, which means you're going to have to communicate. You're going to have to ask questions that may be uncomfortable or hard. Great marital sex is about learning to love someone else the way he or she wants to be loved. It means that sex is not about you and satisfying your needs. It's about meeting your spouse's needs. And 1 Corinthians 7:3-4 tells us, A husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. A wife does not have authority over her own body, but her husband does. Equally, a husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does. So the idea is you have to put away your past. And we do that, we know, by asking God to forgive us. And believe me, if we hadn't have put away a bunch of our past and let God forgive us, we would not be where we are today. So it really is important.
One of the things I do want to remind you, when we talk about a lot of the things we do and we give you God's perspective on that, we are far from being able to condemn anyone in what may be going on in your life or what may not be going on in your life, because our past is pretty nasty as far as that goes. Guys, one of the things I want to talk about is that guys really like to control what goes on in a marriage, and control is where most men fail. But I really
Believe
find
me, I have one of those.
I
in my
really
closet.
find it how far a woman will go to make sure that a guy is not in control. So Helen tries out her new Not Tonight nightgown, and if you'd look over in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a McPherson cartoon. So
He didn't come up with
I
it.
didn't come up with that, but at least someone from my gene pool did somewhere down the road. But guys do like to have control, and that's one of the things that we need as men. We really need to be able to let go. It's real tough for us because as men we're expected to be the physical aggressor. It's easy for us to develop a controlling position in marriage by being so dominant, by proving our masculinity. But in the marital bed, that's really not the place for it. We will have a much healthier relationship if we are willing to submit as often to our wives as our wives submit to us. And this is going to be one of the biggest areas that you may have to deal with, biggest problem areas, because let's just face it, in society today, especially American society, men are just not to be submissive. But marriage is about learning to put someone else's needs above our own, and that goes far beyond the bedroom. It's about graciously doing the mundane things, the everyday things of being a couple, developing a friendship, taking out the garbage, vacuuming the floors. There's in one of the video sessions that Gary Chapman does. Was it Gary Chapman?
Yeah, they watched that, yeah.
Yeah, he talked about, just how fulfilling it is for a wife when you're vacuuming the floors. If you really want to, throw the light switch for her, that's the thing to do, is to vacuum the floors. And for men, it's really one of those things where we need to remember that women like to build up to the whole issue of sex. It really is an all-day affair for women, and it's not all-day sex. It's all day preparing for sex.
No.
So, you can't treat your wife like a servant and expect for her to be eager to have sex with you or sleep with you at night. Your wife's sexual responsiveness will truly be determined by how willingly you are to help out with just the things that you wouldn't even think about. For us, one of the big things really was when I would really do a lot with the kids, and I spent a lot of time with the kids. I coached all three of our kids. You help with the homework, and at least for me, it was when the homework came, or when they'd go into Theresa and ask for questions on the homework, it was like, well, go see your dad. So that became one of the things that always fell into my area, which was great. I loved it. And one of the things that guys have a problem with is we think that sex will fix anything. Well, guys after being married for 20 years, realize that sex doesn't fix anything, especially for your wife. And one of the big things, a good lover works just as hard outside the bedroom as he does inside the bedroom.
And ladies, I'm just going to give you a few tips here before we take a break. Respect for your husband follows you into your bedroom. Respect is a huge issue for men. They love to be respected. Women do too, but for men it is a big issue. It affects your attitude, and it greatly impacts his response. Respect is given, not earned, and it really isn't an option. God tells us scripturally it's not an option. We excel in showing respect when we work hard at being understanding, not demanding, gentle, not judgmental, and polite and not rude. The next time you enter your bedroom, go with an attitude of gratitude. Do you have any idea how many single women would love to be walking into your bedroom? Because they're tired of being single. And they would love to be walking into your bedroom, joined by a husband. Their life up to Christ, waiting for the right man. You even have a bedroom. And they would love to be walking into your bedroom, joined by a husband. And John, you want to put up that other cartoon? So be grateful that you even have a bedroom. And this is kind of how we need to be. That sometimes we're their greatest pain reliever. We can give them what they need, and we need to be available to do that and to do it respectfully. Once we grasp God's intended vision for sex and look at sex through our husband's eyes, our physical desire will fall in line with him. And that's just purely becoming educated about the needs and desires of our husband, realizing how God made him, and that it's not a bad thing, even though the world will tell us, and they slam guys because, all they think about is sex. Well, you know what? God made him that way. And when you are able to put it in a healthy relationship, it's an awesome place to be. Women, we're wordy. It's just one of those things when we watch that on the video with Gary Smalley, we have to have our 250,000 words or whatever it is, and guys have this little amount. So we have the power to kill or give life with our words in the bedroom, and even outside the bedroom. They either poison or they give fruit, and we must choose. Proverbs 18 tells us, life and death are in the power of the tongue, and those who eat it will live with its fruit. So encourage one another, build each other up, and let's talk about building our husbands up, especially to our friends and family, and let them know how important they are.